Okay, welcome everyone. This webinar is Planning for the Post-Pandemic Library. My name is Andrea Lewandowski. I am the Library Consultant for Small Business Development and Technology at the New Jersey State Library. And joining me is Naomi Torres-Velez, who's going to be helping with the technical aspect and monitoring Q&A and chat. And we are also being joined by our wonderful presenters, David Vinjamuri and Joe Huberty. So I will introduce them in a second. But first, I'm going to share my screen real quick. I have as a reminder, you can use both the chat box and the Q&A box for discussion and questions. All of your comments and your feedback are encouraged because that's how we know if you have questions, if you have items to add, since you're all used to Zoom by now, but it can be pretty tricky when you're just speaking to yourself to know what the response is. So we would like this to be as interactive as possible given the platform. In case you're wondering, yes, this is being recorded. It will be shared on the State Library's YouTube channel, and you will get a link emailed to you after the session, probably tomorrow, because it takes a little bit of time to load. We will have an evaluation at the end of today's webinar. The link will be shared in the chat. And we encourage you to fill that out because that helps us to plan future sessions and know what we can do to improve and topics that you would like us to cover. So all of that said, if there are no questions or anything else coming up now, I'm going to introduce our speakers and let them get started. David Vinjamuri is Adjunct Associate Professor of Marketing at NYU, where he teaches graduate students. And he's president of Third Way Brand Trainers, whose clients over the last 16 years include American Express, Marriott, the US Army, Navy, and Commerce Department. He writes the Brand Truth column online for Forbes, which has been read by over 1 million people. David is the author of Library Space Planning, a PLA Guide, Accidental Branding, How Ordinary People Build Extraordinary Brands, and 2 novels. David is also a passionate advocate for public libraries and has audited over 40 libraries for space design efficiency in the past 3 years. He has been named as the inspiration for the soon-to-be famous Illinois Author Contest, which won the John Cotton Dana Library Public Relations Award in 2015. And Joe Huberty is a partner with Engberg Anderson Architects. He has spent his career leading the planning and design of award-winning public and academic library projects across the nation, more than 200 projects to date. Joe sees architecture as a practical art, providing future-friendly, pragmatic, and functional space that is comfortable, aspirational, and inspirational. Libraries are the ultimate embodiment of the relationship between people, services, and space. He is a frequent presenter at state and National Library Association conferences, where he shares stories of how collaborative design can support and enhance public service, the user experience, and staff work effectiveness. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point, and I will turn it over to you guys. Thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thanks so much. Excuse me. So Joe and I met while I was writing this little book here, the Library Space Planning PLA Guide that the American Library Association published in 2019. And we worked together in one of my most nervous professional moments where I had done an audit of a fairly large library, and he was called in to consult on it. We had a couple of very nice conversations, but then he was at the final presentation. At the end of the presentation, when I recommend all of these changes to this library, one of the board members stood up and said, Joe, what do you think about all that? Unfortunately, he was very supportive. And we started collaborating soon after that. And over this last year, we've actually worked on, in 2020 and into this year, we worked together on a very large evaluation for a pretty big library and on a renovation. So we've been thinking about space together for about a year and a half. What we're going to talk about today is trying to understand the effects of the pandemic itself on patrons and what the implications of those changes will be for the library. Part of it has to do with what libraries have done during the pandemic, and part of it will have to do with how patrons will change through the pandemic. The 7 issues that we want to cover, and I do want to point out, I'm actually going to, hang on, share something else really quick. That everything that we're going to talk about today is covered in a online article in Medium called Designing for the Future, the Post-Pandemic Library. You had the link sent out, and you should see it come out again after this as a follow-up. So while you're welcome to take notes, I just want to point out that basically all of what we're talking about today is there available for you for free and available to share online already. And in addition, this recording will be available as well. So, you know, future citizens of 2022, you can tell me why I'm wrong. So the 7 things we want to cover are: 1, the importance of the concept of territoriality and how that may change going forward, how we're already seeing it change and how we expect it to remain different. The second thing is the expansion of services during the pandemic, particularly things like curbside delivery, how they may have triggered a crisis of rising expectations, meaning that people are not going to give up those things as easily as you would like, and that has implications for the design of your library, and particularly if you're designing new space, it becomes really important to think about that. Joe is going to talk about the adaptable library, and probably, you know, the single most important lesson we've learned during the pandemic is that you don't know exactly how things are going to go, and you have to have a space that can conform to need rather than dictate the needs of the patrons, because we can't fully anticipate those. 2 of the trends that we were seeing before the pandemic that were dramatically accelerated by the pandemic is the importance of the library sort of as a municipal point of service. So departments outside of the library in the municipality looking to the library to help deliver their services. And then the library is a civic hub. And, you know, if we really think of particularly what's happened over the last 40 days, the importance of rebuilding our democracy is sort of critical, with people living in these different information streams and demonizing each other and everything, largely because they just are not getting the same facts, same information. And you know, the library, as I'll show you, is the most trusted institution in society today, and it's quite important in the prospects for sort of rebuilding a functioning democracy. And then Joe will talk about delivering services outside of the library. One of the things that also has become clear, it was true before the pandemic, it's more true now, is that the reach of the library, particularly in underserved areas and areas with special needs populations, extend well beyond the door. And we'll talk briefly about the how all of this changes the way that you approach staffing, hiring, and the way that people conduct their workday within the library. Okay, so to get right to it. So one of the most important concepts to think about, and we've become very, very aware of it during the pandemic, is personal space. And there's a American anthropologist, Edward Hall, who created a discipline called proxemics, where he looked at and measured in different cultures, particularly in ours, the distance at which we feel comfortable with people we know or do not know, based on our relationship to them, and also based on the environment that we're in. And roughly speaking, in public, outdoors, it's, you know, 8 to 10 or 12 feet is the distance that we're comfortable with people we don't think are going to attack us. But then there's social distance, people we're connected to, which is 4 to 8 feet. Personal distance, people we are friends with, and then intimate distance inside of 18 inches. So Intimate distance, of course, varies by age. Younger people have a broader definition, but there have always been exceptions. You know, exceptions may be crowds. Exceptions may be being inside a subway, whether it's New York or Tokyo, or an elevator. And I do want to point out, by the way, that these situations, while we tolerate them, we're not really comfortable with them. And if you're ever in a crowded elevator or a crowded subway, you may notice not a lot of conversation. It's not accidental. Personal distance being 1.5 to 4 feet. Again, there have always been exceptions. And I would argue the library has sort of created a long-lasting exception to territoriality, which is probably going to end. Social distance being 4 to 8 feet. You know, so this is a distance where people that we share society with, and you could think of being inside the same library as having something shared. So we don't think they're going to attack us, but how close do we feel? Now, if you think of CDC guidelines and this idea of, you know, in a situation where you have good ventilation, et cetera, ideally outdoors and ideally masked, you still want sort of the 6 feet barrier, and that fits right within social distance. So this territoriality not only protects us against attack, it protects us in some sense against disease as well. And there's your public distance. When we think about design and territoriality, if I can boil it down to something that Joe said very explicitly to me the other day, is like too much stuff and too little space for too long. You know, libraries, in trying to do everything and trying to be everything to everybody, tend over time to accumulate stuff, whether the stuff is collection items, seating, tables, etc. And that has had the effect of squeezing the actual patrons into smaller and smaller amounts of space. And we've gotten people comfortable with this over time, but I would challenge you that if you have, for instance, a 6-person wooden table in your library, think about it before the pandemic, and you may realize that you almost never saw more than 1 or sometimes 2 people sitting in that space, and the 2 people would probably be catty corner at the extreme ends of the table to give themselves, you know, 6 or so feet between them. So it was not a particularly efficient use of that space to begin with, and now it may not be acceptable at all. So some of the things you can still do, you know, if we need to cheat after the pandemic, is look at barriers, look at the placement of chairs. If people are sitting out and facing away from each other, that may be more acceptable. Ironically, one of the few academic studies on this shows that men actually urinate more effectively in bathrooms when there are barriers. So there you go. But also in the design of offices, we found that, you know, the barriers are important for noise, but people still don't feel that comfortable being that close together. Hence, particularly in open offices, the proliferation of headphones. So look at, you know, spacing that somehow combines barriers and angles and all that to give yourself, although, you know, all of us would kill for a library space like that, but to give yourself some more sense of safety as well as openness.
Right. That last image, I think, is essential. It's a luxury space in many ways, and many people are confronted with buildings that are way too small to begin with. And devoting this amount of space to layering different buffers between people as individuals, between groups of people, and then between types of use, really does a lot to make them comfortable in that most innate sense, and really promotes productivity and effectiveness and raises the quality of a library experience. But it does diminish the typical measures that we've been programmed to acknowledge: numbers of seats, numbers of computers, and so on. But if you're trying to anticipate future behavior patterns and getting people to be comfortable coming back into facilities again, I think this is the model that you would aspire to as much as you can within the practical realities of the space that you have to work with.
Yeah, and I completely get it. If you're in Morris or Bergen County and you're sitting in a library that's a combination of an 18th century house with 3 modern additions and it looks nothing like this, it's understandable to feel exasperated with your challenge. But what I'd suggest to you is one of the things that I really focused on when I was writing the space planning guide for PLA is the idea that you should not think of your space as a single functional zone or single functional place at all times, because you really have a different library in different parts of the day and different times of the week. So when you have young children in your library, perhaps in the morning, and then they go home for nap time, your library changes. If you have, say, elementary and middle school age children come into the library at 3 or 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon, it changes again. And maybe if you have programs in the evenings for adults, it changes yet again. And when you're renovating or when you're making changes, sometimes it's a matter of saying, hey, what is the circulation effectiveness of the collection items that are taking up a lot of space here? If I display those more effectively, but make the displays movable, can I then make my space more flexible to do different things at different times of the day? Or even in the children's room, can I make this an all or 2/3 super young kids children's room at 10 a.m. and make it a comfortable to 4th graders children's room at 3 p.m. Those kinds of things can help if you're in a limited space. Joe's going to talk more about that. The other thing that you may see is that now that we have become incredibly uncomfortable with people brushing by us on the street, even masked, frankly, that one-way pathways are going to be more comfortable for people. And while you can do things like put arrows or footprints or whatever to guide people through the library, subtle cues can work as well. So here at the Barrington Area Library that Joe worked on, you can see that the inbound pathway and the outbound pathway are canted to, sort of favor people moving in the correct direction. Joe, do you want to say anything else about those?
I think that's the essence of it.
Okay. So after the pandemic, I think you have to assume in most scenarios that people are going to want to be 6 feet away when they're sitting or moving through space from anyone that they're not, that didn't come into the library with. And that may persist with certain exceptions past the point at which we're done with the health restrictions of the pandemic. If any of you have friends or parents or grandparents who lived through the Great Depression, even as young children, who are still around, you may have noticed that the kind of frugal spending ways and the sense of self-reliance, all of those things, they didn't become less as those people became adults. They were sort of reinforced. Even in the post-war boom, those are the people who knew how to hang on to a penny and valued hard work and didn't want to have a single electric light bulb running in the house unless somebody was sitting underneath it. That's going to be true of our generation too. And to answer Karen's question, so will the 6-foot rule apply to the way patrons are seated during programs? That is a good question.
Yeah.
Joe's going to talk about, how we sort of address that, because my personal feeling is that it's going to be a little bit like handicap seating in a theater, which is that you may be able to, in general, sit people a bit closer, although I would suspect with a little bit more spacing than pre-pandemic. But there are certainly going to be people who will want the full 6 feet, and a portion of your audience is always going to have to be set that way. But the key thing is going to be allowing people also move their seats a little bit and leaving room for that. Joe, do you want to say anything about that? I know it's previewing what you're going to do momentarily.
Right. Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit, but I do think that the 6 feet is going to become a little bit more of a norm throughout the building. You may be able to push it a little bit, but yeah, we've got a few pictures coming up that will illustrate the point.
Okay. And again, in the places where that's impossible, you can ameliorate that problem with angled seating, facing away from people and barriers. I have seen studies suggesting epidemiologically that it's better to be seated a little bit closer to somebody at a meal, but catty corner than directly across from them and 2 feet further away, for what that's worth. So if that's the intuition that people have, that'll make them feel more comfortable. And this is assuming the pandemic is over and it's not an actual health risk. Again, one-way pathway design. Importantly, and Joe will talk more about this, be ready to experiment, because whatever we're telling you today, the biggest message should be you're not going to be able to fully anticipate. And if you don't leave yourself the room for adaptability, for experimentation, for being able to change the way things are set up, if your furniture, your fixtures, etc., doesn't accommodate changes, it's going to be hard to get this exactly right. And absolutely think modular. So the second trend to talk about today is this question of this crisis of rising expectations. So a lot of times societies experience revolutions not when things are terrible, it's actually when things are getting better. So that's in political science term, what they call crisis rising expectations. In the library, what's happened is that many of you have gone to extraordinary lengths to try to serve patrons during the pandemic. And in particular, the one thing I would point out is curbside delivery, which is fantastic, but is essentially a concierge service that you've now introduced to your entire population of patrons. And I think it would probably be, although people are excited and grateful to have had this during the pandemic, there are populations, elderly or persons with handicaps or disabilities, parents with cars full of screaming children, or maybe toddlers, commuters, rushing to a train when people use trains again, all of those kinds of things where this is still a valid service. And I don't think people are going to be that excited about giving it up. Having said that, that has a lot of implications for your library. I've been in a number of libraries since this all started, and it is amazing to me that the space that sorting and setting up to extend your services into the parking lot area or to the front of the library takes up in what is going to eventually be, for those of you who are not fully open today, the working library. One thing that probably will go along with this is the idea of having a concierge. So having an active staff member somewhere near the very front of the building who can head off these things. If there are people, we may create a new type of patron after the pandemic, which is not senior, not having a disability, but just being sort of pandemic sensitive or health sensitive, who for some period of time, if not forever, wants to spend as little time in public spaces as possible. This point of service will help that person. So you can stage hold books out there. You can do those types of things. But also, frankly, if you're gonna run curbside pickup, it may be helpful to have the person that close to begin with. This also implies, how are you going to stage the books, et cetera. Particularly if you're doing a renovation or designing new space, really think about roll in, roll out storage that's convenient to the front of the library. Another thing, it's important to emotionally support patrons as well. And one of the things Joe and I separately were both talking about for a while before this started, and together feel very strongly about, is that large circulation desks become points of friction. So in my discipline, in marketing terms, friction is something that doesn't keep somebody from doing something that they want to do, but it makes it a little bit less likely. So if it's harder, if you feel a little bit uncomfortable entering the library because the librarians are behind a very large piece of furniture, you feel a little bit less comfortable talking to them or engaging with them, and the entryway doesn't feel as welcome, you'll still go when you absolutely need something, but will you go for the extra visit when you just sort of want something? will that be the first place you turn? And we see over large numbers of visits, you actually see measurable changes when you do things like open up barriers or take those the security devices and make them less obvious, and don't feel like you're being squeezed like a sardine as you're entering the library. So creating service points in particular that have lower barriers, where the librarians are more accessible, understanding that for today, they're still going to have plexiglass in front of them, can be important. Also, thinking about ways to accommodate both yourself and the patrons, particularly in places like, Wisconsin, where Joe is, or New York, New England area where I am, and obviously all of you in New Jersey, things like a drive-through window could be very, very helpful if you have the chance to do that. So question from Jen, making the staff feel safer during the pandemic, also when dealing with irate patrons. So I cannot offer you any advice if there's a concern for physical danger, right? If you're in that kind of a community, either because it's so polarized by politics, or if it's a high crime neighborhood or whatever, I won't, at all pretend to suggest that I know what to do. What I would say is, in most other types of situations, the less that the librarian feels, and then this is drawn from retail experience, right? From how we deal with things in the rest of the consumer service world, right? The less a patron feels like you're an authority figure, and the more a patron feels like you're there to help them, the less confrontation tends to escalate. And things like barriers, while they can be somewhat effective safety points, although, in most cases, unless you're very serious about it, it's not going to keep you safe. They also tend to increase that feeling of dominance that creates that reaction in people. So it's a trade-off, right? There's no ideal situation to that. Joe, you want to talk about this?
So I think one of the important parts to acknowledge is that some of these amenities that are becoming essential services dictate different uses of space, both inside a building and outside a building. And what we're finding is that the lessons of this pandemic have made many municipalities a little bit more willing to tolerate the experiment. And we've been trying to sneak in things like drive-through services in areas that in the past would have been thought unbuildable. There's a tolerance for a little bit slower movement, a little bit tighter turning radius, still maintaining those kinds of safety features that you would hope for. You can get past someone who's in line in front of you, for example, if you've completed your service. But thinking about ways to perhaps challenge previous preconceptions in the way site space in particular is organized, so that you can allow pedestrian and vehicular traffic to move in ways that aren't in conflict with one another, and allow you the ability to adapt to a more pandemic-centric means of delivering service that precludes you from letting people into the building and relies more on this drive-up aspect. There's opportunities here that people are willing to explore that hadn't been there in the past. The corollary to this diagram, of course, is all of the organization on the inside that has to go with that. David alluded to some of it. And the surprising bit about all of those discussions has been, you're just giving over more space to the staff. And we really want to make sure that people start to think of the space that supports things like drive-up services as public space. This is a valued service that most communities prize. In fact, when we do community satisfaction surveys, small individual or small group study rooms and drive-up services are consistently the top two items that people request in their library if they don't already have them. So thinking about the service that goes in, the space that goes in to these services as public space really reinforces the notion that you're providing direct service to your customers and can ameliorate some of the concerns that trustees, city councils might have about that type of usage.
Yeah, and Jen followed up her comment just to say that she's actually thinking of children invading her personal space and becoming irate, which, having 3 small children at home, I completely can agree with her on that. I do want to point out we're talking about the post-pandemic library, so absolutely do whatever it is that you need to do to keep a potentially infected person from sneezing in your face right now. But hopefully, you know what we always find with children, with our own children and neighbor children, that when you get down to their level, they become less threatening because you're less threatening to them. And that's sort of the idea, you know, in a way, behind all of this. It's sort of putting yourself more on a level with your patrons. Okay, so things to think about after the pandemic: curbside may remain. The concierge will sort of allow you to extend your reach to the exterior of the library more easily. Think about storage and staging near the entrance while the library is open. So how are you going to manage those two things, particularly if you're in a legacy space that you don't have much of a chance to adjust for that? You know, think about a drive-through renovations. Think seriously about a roll and roll out storage space. Like the number one thing I don't see people planning for, even as recently as 6 or 8 months ago, when they're doing a multi-million-dollar renovation, is storage. Really, really, really underappreciated. And of course, any of your working librarians or shelvers or whatever will tell you, wow, something that's right off the room where I need to use it is way better than something that's on the other side of the building. And yet you still see folks design, and I'm not talking about librarians, but you still see designs not created by Joe, you know, where there's one central storage area, and that's not what you want. Okay, Joe, adaptability.
Yeah, I really want to emphasize that a lot of this comes out of the analysis that David has done, the thoughts of day parts, really organizing your space to do multiple duty within a day part and then across day parts. So when we're thinking about the examples that you're about to see, the underlying goal here is to be able to utilize space as effectively as you can across as much of the day as you can. I think that was a goal earlier, that good buildings really allow you a flexibility of uses because we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. But this notion of being able to respond quickly to different scenarios with respect to public health really demonstrates the need that the ability to change is more of a day-to-day time frame than it might be in the past, week to week, month to month, year after year. Those are good sound planning principles, but more than ever, the ability to instantly change, or as close to instantly as we can make it, is a value that space can offer to you if you have that opportunity. Go to the next one. All right. So a series of spaces, some of it is about welcoming and that orientation. There is a concierge function at that public service desk. You can see in the after shot at the first floor, direct line of sight from the door. I've just cleared the door in this photograph. So you can see it's much more inviting than the before shot. It's essentially the same space and character, a little bit more attention to acoustics. But really the goal is to create a space that's open and inviting. Off to the left-hand side of these images is the main meeting room. So there's a pre-event space. Functions can spill out. The doors open up so that there's overflow space. They have art exhibits here. And during the pandemic, this is where we staged curbside pickup materials so that the staff could function out of the lobby. There is adjacent storage space, as David points out. So it's doing a lot of things. And that's another aspect of getting as much out of each individual space as you can.
Well, and I have to warn New Jersey librarians that as Joe shows you these pictures of Illinois libraries, that a lot of them look sort of like cathedrals compared to what, you know, most of us deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Right. Yeah, and this one's even larger. But the notion of adaptability, flexibility, a lot of this has the traditional character that a number of libraries are looking for in terms of the nature of the materials, the sense of size, permanence, but everything you're looking at is modular and reconfigurable. That's true of the desks, it's true of the shelving elements. There's actually pretty large glides on the shelving units. They didn't like the wheeled look, but these are all modules that can be shoved around to promote different circulation patterns, sometimes be condensed so that they can use the space for big events. And I think one of the things we really want to underscore with this this kind of concept is that this space is part of a larger arrival sequence. You can pull parts of the collection out and feature them either by topic, timeliness, relevance to current events, anything of that nature. An important aspect of that, if you want to go to the next slide, David, is to think about the fixtures themselves. These are a little zippier. There's some that are a little bit more spinner-like in the next image. But the ability to modulate the space on a fine level with some of the fixtures, you can start to implement these incrementally day one as you're starting to anticipate the project. But then they're positioned in ways that allow you to convert that kind of space into different types of functions. This is a library that's really pretty big on traveling exhibits, and you can see the scale that's the space offers, sometimes two-story, but more often they're more humble, but you want to get that kind of presence that the entry area space offers. So sometimes you do want this to be collection, sometimes you want it to be a special event, sometimes you want it to be an exhibit. The idea of flexibility really wants to start on that grandest of scales, the building or room level, and then move into the smaller scale furniture, seating, collection space.
I just want to point out, this is a library that Joe has worked on for years. Before I knew him, I actually also did an audit of their space, and they have an incredibly interesting business model, which is that they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for these rotating exhibits that they bring in that are museum quality, but then, and they fundraise to do that. They have an incredibly effective fundraiser, but then it draws in this huge number of school groups regionally that actually powers sort of the economic model of the whole library. So it's a really interesting library in general. Sorry,
Right.
John, go ahead.
No, and between that and some of the youth services active learning, they're really trying to tap into user groups that wouldn't traditionally be using the full range of library services. So it's a way of getting people into the door the first time. The ultimate was they had live programs out in this same space. So this has been media, it's been a dinosaur. They had a program where when the space station was flying overhead, they had an uplink and you could chat with an astronaut. So it's really finding ways to tap into people's curiosity on a number of different fronts. And this all happens at the front door with the notion of what's important on a particular day or week is what you want to feature and expose as many people to as you can. This is the ultimate picture of exposing people to something or other. And clearly in the current situation, no one would be comfortable getting this close to one another. But you get a sense of how much a space can be adapted to different purposes, and whether it's a program for children or seniors, focused on music, a local athlete, whatever it happens to be. The idea of being able to push a lot of the collection, this is normally the new media and new book collection zone and some soft seating. There's space to push all of that into other areas of the library. And again, go ahead, David. If you don't have that space, you're making decisions on how much to devote to certain aspects of your service. And thinking about, do I have a place to push things is part of the evaluation of whether or not things on wheels make some sense. But if you can think about ways to do double duty, that's important. At the other end of the spectrum, the furniture level, thinking about modularity and flexibility is important. Here's a series of two-person tables that we've also used to be one-person tables in other parts of the building. They can be ganged together. They're very modular, have straight edges. It can be easily configured to be a group. There's enough space to be able to create barriers, but all of the connections are modular, and they're pretty easy to make connections to the floor. It's easy for people to bring their own device and plug in. So thinking about the modularity and the flexibility of things like building systems and the infrastructure that makes that all possible is important. And then the furniture itself. It's not always about sitting and reading or traditional study. Things like maker, crafting, general experimentation, being able to use them for a wide range of user groups. So flexibility, one person can tilt it, push it out of the way, bring it out, adjust the height, is pretty significant. If you don't have easy access to power, there are systems out now that have pretty extensive battery capabilities. These are pretty fancy looking, almost craft shaped modular battery units that are checked out at public service points. And it's 3 to 4 hours worth of charge on a device. And the library has carts either out in the public area or behind the scenes that keeps a steady supply of these available to accommodate people during rush hours. So if you've got infrastructure built in, great. If you don't, there are ways around that too. And the next one really shows about thinking about space in less traditional ways. Sometimes it is important to look like, whatever. Sometimes it's more important to be expressive of or evocative of the flexibility and the sense that this is a place for experimentation, both you as a library and you as a visitor to the library. So encouraging with durable surfaces, flexibility, ways to take on whatever the interest of the day happens to be. And so carrying that thought about flexibility from furniture to infrastructure to building really illustrates the point that flexibility and adaptability really has to be coordinated across a variety of scales. At the room level, things like walls can be modular. I think this has a series of clicks, David, to animate. Yeah. So it can be general open computing. It can be enclosed instruction. Right. The next one is a story time room. It lets it be open play or enclosed for programmed events. When it's at the front of a department, it gives you certain flexibilities. When it's at the back, it really exposes people to all of the good things between a departmental entry and the program space. But making sure that these kinds of rooms don't sit empty over the course of a day. Story time is a limited amount of time. There is time to set up and break down, but in between, you can really put these spaces to good use. And this is the ultimate expression of that. The big doors on the right-hand side lead into the storage area, which is the key to the flexibility in this space. So whether it's the traditional meeting setup, and you can imagine those chairs being spaced differently, or more of a seminar. Next configuration is a bit of a lounge, homework club, chess club kind of arrangement. You see the big glass doors at the back of the room opened up, and the lounge function continues around a small two-sided fireplace. This is an 11,000 square foot neighborhood library, and this is the primary corner. So it's about advertising events at this space to the community. It's a fairly impoverished part of Milwaukee, and the idea was to make a statement with a pretty fancy building and things like a fireplace that these kinds of quality public spaces are for everybody. So when you think about sending civic messages, it's important to remember that open societies require open meetings, require open meeting rooms. And so featuring this prominently on a significant corner was part of the underlying planning. But then getting the most out of this space, because this room cannot sit empty or look dark at any part of the day, making sure that this room was always in use. And that really gets to the nature of the flexibility. And that in turn is dependent on a place to put some of these furnishings when they're not in use for a particular day use pattern, hence the storage room. These kinds of spaces, public gathering spaces, can really do a number of things, more than just meetings. This is a series of images from Madison where the demonstration kitchen was really developed in a way that promotes its use as a separate enclosed room for things like training. They do small programs for kids to learn how to bake, prepare healthy meals. They do community meals once a month. There's a different organization that prepares a meal. It is a health department approved service kitchen. They run classes on entrepreneurship, how to start your own food-based business. And then they do the HGTV video Food Network kind of videography for demonstration projects. And so the room has a really wide range of capabilities. And interestingly enough, it supports library space on one side and a community rec center on the other. And each of the institutions, library, school district, parks and rec, use the facility for a pretty wide variety of programs. This room is never empty. So I think our big lessons are to think about flexibility on a variety of scales. When you're thinking about adaptability after a pandemic, that flexibility really does help with spacing people out. I think it will move from something like where we're all 12 feet apart to 6 feet apart to maybe as a group we're a little bit more in a traditional mode with space between groups of familiar people. But that flexibility of space is useful at that level. And then because no matter how well you're situated in terms of physical space or financial resources, you never have enough room or money to build everything that you would like to have. Thinking about ways to do double duty across the various day parts is an important aspect of adaptability. So multiple uses of a same configuration as well as multiple configurations is part of the thought process.
So I think, Joe, you're going to continue on here, right?
Yeah, I think the last set of images of the Madison Library really is a notion of a continuing trend, this ability to introduce a wide variety of people to a broader range of municipal services in an environment that isn't very threatening. Libraries don't come with a lot of the institutional character that might put people off. They tend to be friendlier, more welcoming, a more democratic place, easily accessible. So the thought of using them to introduce people to healthier lifestyles, health literacy, financial literacy, whatever it might be, and open a range of services is part of what a library can do. If you look at that into things like basic health, I think the next one in Pima County.
Yeah, and sorry, and I'll continue on. I apologize, Joe. I want to point out, this is a shout out to Camden County library system. And what I love about, what they've done here is they're expanding. They're taking that beyond the library with a mobile kitchen, which, the importance of, we're going to talk about this momentarily, but the importance of projecting the services of the library beyond the doors is incredibly high. And I just thought this is an incredibly creative use of doing that in a way that you don't see a lot. In Pima County, Arizona, they've actually instituted full-time nursing in the libraries themselves. So they're doing health screenings, blood pressure, health education, all that with registered nurses. Joe, this is something you created, right?
Right. Right. During the pandemic, it provided office space for staff, but it's really envisioned as an entrepreneurial, returning to school, tutoring, proctoring kind of zone that supports a wide range of users. It's all about.
Sorry, go ahead.
It's about creating a variety of scaled spaces that support individual and small group.
And the other thing that's great about this kind of space is if you think post-pandemic of the libraries becoming a focal point for some of these other services. So if you have a population of people experiencing homelessness, if you have a refugee population, if you have an immigrant population that part of which may be undocumented, and there are services that they need that are, municipal, but they're not library services, and you can provide some offices that can be used by different agencies and reach those people where they are instead of trying to infiltrate the community to get them to come to you, that's going to be much more effective. Mm-hmm. And so the question Dale asks is, the nursing services funded through the library's regular budget, or is the library just providing the space? I would have to check on this, but my understanding was that the budget was increased to allow for that. And remember that that's, a public health concern. So it's a fair ask from the municipality if you want to do something like that.
Right. You all probably know this better than we do, but our experience has been that the library in many ways is developing partnerships, and part of that is providing the space, and the expertise and the funding for some of that comes from a pretty wide variety of sources. But the key element is you have the approachable, flexible, friendly environment that a lot of people can take advantage of.
Yeah, and I can tell you, in one of my sort of side jobs is that I'm a locally elected municipal official, and we are struggling with how to extend our services, particularly during the pandemic. So when a community center or a library or somebody else approaches and says, look, I've got this space, I have the people you're trying to reach here, that's a really good way to secure funding from us. Another thing to think about is that business itself is going through a transition right now. Small business employs over half the US workforce, and they have disproportionately been hurt by the pandemic. And there are entire sectors of small businesses that have been failing across the US. And a lot of it, particularly for more traditional businesses, whether it's a bakery or a bookstore or whatever, they have to make a transition that folks had made before. There's a pathway, but they may not personally understand that. So to the extent that the library can increase training and tutoring and maybe even fund licenses for things like Shopify or Google AdWords, or helping them understand how to use Salesforce if they're a business-to-business business, etc. That kind of training can be very, very helpful in this environment. You have a whole group of people who become, what I would call gap employers and gap employees, meaning that they are not unemployed, but they're also not earning enough to survive in this environment. And making transitions, really flexing your business when that happens to you is really particularly difficult. So, libraries can be an assistance there. This is from Miami. There was a recognition there that with a population of people experiencing homelessness, that some basic services that weren't there. And this is maybe something that some of you encounter in your libraries, like how do we deal with people who don't have a place to sleep, etc., and who when they use a restroom have more needs. So do you think about when you're designing or renovating, do you think about having attended bathrooms that have a shower in there, et cetera, that are maybe even in a separate bank, so the people who really need them don't lose dignity by using them? It's sort of getting to the point where you can say, these are the problems we're stuck with. We can't solve all these, but we can help people experiencing them. And if you can do that, it's sort of a win-win for everybody in the community. When you think of the library as a municipal point of service, that has to do with extending the services of the municipality into the library to be more efficient. But beyond that, libraries have an important role as a center for civic life, for understanding the democracy and the function of local government, as well as regional and national government. Libraries are the most trusted institution. Believe it or not, this chart predates the last 4 years, in the presidency and the Supreme Court and Congress and everything else. Library even then was more trusted than the military, small business, the police, the church, anything. And this is a combination of Gallup and Pew data, by the way. And so, the need to teach people how to evaluate things that they're being told is more important than ever. And there is no institution in the community that has leadership that is trained in data management, that is trained in understanding how to get accurate and trustworthy data more than the libraries. This is a graphic created for the UN because of the danger of false information, particularly during the pandemic. So teaching your patrons how to navigate their information streams, particularly we expect in the business community now, we expect to see changes to social media platforms through regulation coming in the next year. But, it's unknown. It's a very, people migrate to different platforms. It's impossible to regulate everything. So the skill of people to really have critical evaluation of information they're being presented is going to continue to be more and more important. And libraries really have a central role that they can play in this. What are you going to need to do that? For one thing, more instructional space and more flexible instructional space. There will be more tutoring for sure. So thinking about, for instance, if you have an immigrant population and they're non-native English speakers, then ESL may be a big part of your day. So when you're working with a space planner or an architect to design your space, are you thinking about the acoustic requirements of having 30 different one-on-one conversations happening at the same time in the same space in the same time of the day, while there are senior patrons and others trying to read quietly? Are you designing your library for that? That's something to think about. But civic education too. Libraries don't just have to be the place where you put voting machines, once or twice a year. They can also be the place where we learn the reason to vote, and the fact that, every time you turn on your water or walk outside your house or drive a car, you're engaging with local government. And that's, just as important as, these sort of big national issues that we hear about. So things to think about: technology needs to be more agile. Remember that if you put a friendlier face on your website, if you make your app easier to use, that the library becomes friendlier too. It's not just design of space. A lot of times it's design of technological infrastructure. That you will need more instructional spaces. Tutoring in particularly may need friendly spaces. So Joe's going to talk for a second about projecting your reach beyond the walls of the library.
Right. We can move through these pretty quickly. I know we're coming up on the hour, and most of these are topics we've touched on. This notion of libraries being really adept at breaking out of the boundaries of their space. So whether it's playgrounds, drive-through, using everything that you can to introduce 24/7 virtual services, providing Wi-Fi connectability, taking advantage of your parking lot for places for people to pull up and access broadband through their phone. Sometimes people have a device, but they don't have access to those high-speed connections. So just about any place in your community is a potential spot for you to deliver service. Some of that's a pretty significant investment, like a mobile technology vehicle, a bookmobile. Some of it's just building in the capacity within your buildings to be a hotspot in the adjacent streets, parking lots, parks, whatever it happens to be. So thinking about those aspects, really think as broadly as you can, and don't be bound by the land that you happen to own. Think about the ability of taking services to people. It's kind of the reverse of build it and they will come. It's think about where they are and take service to them. And that notion of the techmobile, bookmobile, foodmobile, toolmobile being whatever it needs to be. I think this notion of integrating library service into daily life the way retail has been. I can get just about anything delivered within a day from whoever it is, local business, giant global corporations. I think that's an expectation, one of those crisis of rising expectation items. And think about the device as well as the content. There are communities where access to a device is as difficult as access to broadband or a particular piece of software. So think about the full spectrum of the particular service and how can you help support delivery of those components to an individual.
And just going to talk for a minute about staff implications.
Yeah. I think you all know this, that money and space gets invested in the public side of the building. And in many ways, what's left is turned over to the staff and you're asked to make do. The same is true of your time. If there's ways of freeing up time to provide more direct value added service to your members, great. Technology has some capabilities in that regard. I think as people evaluate sort of the size of collections, there's a cost benefit analysis to the investment of these devices. They are getting more efficient, easier to maintain, and the amount of financial resource that you invest in your staff may be better focused on direct interaction with the public than on material handling. So there's a full range of questions that go along with automation, but it's important to think through that. And then acknowledge that the people that are in your building 8 hours a day are the staff. So appropriate space, both for health reasons and for efficiency in their accomplishment of specific tasks. Their effectiveness in many ways is influenced by whether or not they spend time fighting a building or whether the building is arranged to support them in their endeavors. Yeah, we also want to acknowledge that the nature of the work is changing over time, but there is still a component that's out with the public And there's a component that's really behind the scenes and focused and much more introverted. And the right kind of space to support the right kind of work effort is important.
If you think of, we'd like to divide the work that your staff are doing into sort of 3 zones of focused work, which should really be done in staff areas, interruptible work, which is done at the larger service points, but then fully engaged customer focused work. And remember that, for most people, a mix of those is going to be helpful. And very few people, have the sort of mindset where they can be fully standing at a concierge desk the entire day. So think about rotation as well.
So we've been encouraging people to take a critical eye towards their back of house service spaces. Are you putting people in proximity and risking health? Are you putting them in such proximity that they aren't comfortable, that the staff's territoriality is acknowledged and respected? This goes directly to their effectiveness. So assessing capabilities. And then next slide, David. Maybe spacing some of those things out and arranging them in ways that don't encourage people to transit through people's private workspaces. I'm using private in a pretty loose way. There's a work zone and a corridor or a pathway, but the pathway shouldn't go through my workspace. And then think about ergonomics. We're all human beings. That interface between public and staff, and then comfort for staff can really be encouraged or discouraged by furniture selections. The big one is the top one. There's 2-hour, 4-hour, 8-hour kind of endeavors, and the ergonomics of each are different. And then the last one, we talked a lot about pathways through the public zone. Think about pathways through the staff zone. It can make a tremendous impact on the quality of the work experience.
So, we're coming towards the end, and then we're going to open it up for more questions. I'll try to answer one that's in the Q&A already. We can also promote you so you can speak live if you have a question you want to interact directly on. Interpersonal space has changed. More stuff is not always better. I think this was true before. And I particularly remember a library in New Jersey that had a children's room that had to be demolished because it was structurally unsound. It was an extension. And because of that, they sort of crammed a lot of stuff into a very small amount of space, and they had lost their ability to do story time, which, would bring 60 or 70 kids into the building. And by trying to do less, but then making their spaces more flexible, that was a way to recover the ability to actually do more. It's the stuff a lot of times that prevents our relationships. So, we should all be inner shakers. We should all want to have all the furniture hanging on the walls at the end of the day so we can sweep the floor clear and clear our minds at the same time. And, you all know this, but as you're having these conversations with your municipal leaders, with your sources of funding, if any of you are blessed enough to be in special tax districts, and with your boards, your role, if anything, will grow over time. Libraries are anchoring communities, they have for years, but they now, I believe, and I'm going to write more about this soon, maybe our best bet to rebuild democracy. I do want to say that, we both do this professionally and together, that if you're actually working on something right now and you want help, there's 2 things that we can do. One is a space audit, which I, have been doing for in New Jersey libraries for several years now. And the part of the focus of that is to help you do things that are either free or cheap and can be done sort of immediately, as well as planning for renovation. We also together, my firm and Joe's firm, work on sort of cost estimates for renovations with layout and floor plan recommendation in CAD, working with one of Joe's experienced interior designers. And both of those have a discount if you want to engage us to do them. That's it for the commercial message that keeps both of our firms happy. But we're just happy that you spent time with us. This is our contact information, and we're going to open this floor up. And I'm going to start with 2 questions from I hope it's Regina, but if I pronounced that incorrectly, I apologize. So where do libraries look for money to make some of these changes? Are there any small practical things that can be done for free to be in accordance with the suggested changes here? So let me answer part of that question. I'll ask, Joe will also probably have an answer on that. And then we'll go to the second part of Gina's question, then we'll open it up to others. One thing I would suggest, if you want to improve your pathway flow through the library to make people feel more comfortable, because there's not a lot of people standing looking and they're able to find things more quickly, is window your existing stacks where you're not able to eliminate them or turn them into true displays. And what I mean by that is, it's very likely that many of you have books on the bottom shelf and you've taken off the books on the bottom shelf and the top shelf of your 6 to 8 foot stacks, because you don't want to make it hard for patrons, who may not be comfortable kneeling down or, are not tall enough to reach the top. But the reality is, if you actually look at your circulation off of those shelves, you'll find that it's quite low, and it would be just as easy for that person to get help from a librarian to get those things in the relatively rare circumstance where they're going to get something off there. But if instead you take that space and instead clear 1 or 2 shelves off at eye level at about 4 to 5 feet in your displays, and put just 3 books facing outward in each segment of that shelf, that's windowing, and you do that through the stacks. So now you can actually see, if you don't have a divider there, you can see all the way through the stacks. You will open up the space. You'll make it more efficient for people to be browsing as they move through the space. You'll also anchor the shelving in the sense that people will know, if they don't intuitively understand Dewey, or if you don't have fantastic signage, they'll sort of know what's on the shelf by seeing what's being displayed. And one of the libraries I worked with in Illinois did this in a part of their library, and they increased their circulation in that area in those stacks by 25% just by making those changes that took them like a day to do. So that's one cheap thing that I can offer to you. Joe, what would you add to that discussion?
I think that's the easy one. The other notion is to think about simple things like moving things out of the way. Fewer is sometimes better, and that doesn't take much effort or cost. The other thing is to think just a little bit more strategically. If you have a capital reserve fund or access to funds and general support of repair, trying to make sure that the work is conducted in such a way that the arranged space left at the end of it incorporates forward-looking principles, not just a rehash of what you've been doing. It's always difficult to disparage paint, because psychologically you can have a tremendous difference on how you feel about a particular space, but you want to go to the underlying structure of how the room is organized and thinking about the psychology of human behavior within those spaces. I think ultimately the whole point of a lot of this is that if you can acknowledge some of those innate behavioral patterns that we bring to space use, especially use of space in a public building, you can create a much more positive experience and drive satisfaction levels with the library experience higher. So space things out.
So
Space what you have.
to answer the second part of your question, you say, how do you get buy-in to justify cost and make them seem reasonable to decision makers? Now, I like to take a very sort of brand management approach to this, which is that I like to, instead of pitching, if you know that you have a solid wall of opposition to making major changes to your space, instead of trying to convince people to change 5,000 square feet or 10,000 square feet, take 100 square feet and change it yourself, and just tell people it's an experiment and it can go back to the way it was before, and measure things like your circulation per square foot in that space when it was stacks, and when you can change it to being a couple of displays with more seating. And what you'll probably find, and what we found in tests, is that actually the displays, though they hold many fewer collection items, will circulate so much faster that you're actually going to circulate more overall than you did with pre-existing shelves. And that is the kind of thing that you can use as a justification to saying, hey, I could be increasing my circulation by 30, 40% if I could make this series of changes. And then I would also be able to make my space flexible enough so that I could do health education or do an extra children's workshop or have two programs going on at the same time. You know, and that's the way I would build an argument personally. So let's open this up. If there are any other questions, I'm going to stop my share right now. If anybody needs that information, just put it in the chat.
There's a question on lockers, after hours pickups.
Go ahead.
Right. Our experience with that has been pretty dramatic. People's satisfactions with the ability to incorporate some form of library experience into an easy routine, part of normal daily life. So positioning pickup lockers, drop-offs in areas where people find themselves on a routine basis without having to make a special trip for that particular aspect of their library experience has been very positive. And again, helps create that relationship between more members of the library and the library. Depending on your service area, how difficult it is to move around the community. Travel time seems to be a more effective measure of convenience than distance. So acknowledging that a lot of people are out during rush hour or other inconvenient times of day. Locating things, transit centers, shopping centers, those kinds of things do have positive impacts. We've seen them used for materials, traditional materials, books, media, but also kits, tools, a library of things kind of idea being extended to lockers as well. So our experience has been very positive.
And thank you to Sheila for pointing out that I'm still in my brain living in 2020 for reasons I can't understand, and the discount offer that I made to you technically expired last February. So that should be February 28th, 2021.
There you go.
Other questions? Again, you can raise your hand. You can type them into the Q&A, or you can type them in the chat. If you raise your hand, we can have Andrea or I will promote you, and you can speak live if you'd like. Okay, well, so if nothing comes up here in the next minute or so, I'll just let you know again, the article is on Medium, and that really contains the majority of what we talked about today, although we did hit some different areas, which I think is great. If you have anything that you're thinking about or just want to run by us, send us an email. If I can answer it in an email or Joe can answer it in an email, there's no charge for that. We're happy to do that. We're really, you know, I do more library work today and less corporate work because it feels like it's not draining my soul. And I like engaging with it. So what I'm actually most concerned about is getting my ideas out there and having a dialogue, because I think libraries are the center of our democracy. And, you know, if they don't succeed, we won't succeed. So I really wish all of you the best, and hope that your 2021 is better than all of our 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was one more question in the chat. Can you explain what the difference is between the $500 and $1,000 audits?
Oh yeah, because so the discount of $500 on the space audit. A space audit is basically an evaluation of your space and concrete suggestions on what you can do to improve it in three ways. One is in the short term without any significant investment of money. So I come in and take pictures of your space. I give you a 50 to 70 page report. And part of that says, here's where to move a display. Here's where a pathway needs to be extended. Here's where you've got something blocking an aisle, like really concrete stuff that you can change today in your library. The second part is what you can do in a mild renovation. So, oh, look, there's a space where if you took out some of the, things that are bolted into the floor while you're replacing the carpet, you could actually make this into a flexible space that can now serve for different needs at different day parts. And part of if you get the book that I published through American Library Association, it's very short, on space planning, you'll see the process. The first thing you do before the space audit is you look at your space usage, who's using it, when they're using it, that's the day parts, and what they're using it for, and that helps me tell you, how to reconfigure it. Then the third part is, if you're going to do a major renovation, what can you do? Now, the cost estimate is actually when you've picked one of those paths, the second or the third path, either a mild renovation or a significant renovation, then an interior designer comes in and we look at how does this actually transform into a CAD CAM layout, and what are the costs going to be, including the engineering cost and the furniture costs, et cetera. We're not going to plan specific furniture. That's, part of actual library design, but this will give you a pretty good estimate that you can use to get a bond approved or get your board approval if it's in a capital fund or whatever. The idea is to get you to the next stage of approval for something that you want to do either way. And if that doesn't answer the question, let me know so we can tell you more.
Yeah. That second layer is a little bit more detailed, and that's where the difference in cost of the study comes in. And so the potential discount can be increased as well.
Yeah, the costs depend upon the size of your library, but it's usually something a little bit under $5,000 for the space audit and something a little bit under or around $10,000
About the same
for the cost estimate. So they're both, the idea is it's a fraction of the amount of money you're going to spend if you actually reconfigure your space. And, my theory from the beginning has been, think carefully about what you want and learn how to ask for what you want and learn how to be specific about what you want. And then when you're dealing with architects, engineers, and designers who are experts in their own subject matter area, you'll be more likely to get what you want. And I know from Joe that they like that better too.
I feel like we can add that to the list of things that we don't get taught in library school.
Yeah. Well, my goal, I have to tell you, my goal in life is to stop being a marketing teacher for business people and eventually, teach at library school and teach space planning and marketing and public relations and stuff like that, because I think that would be way more fun.
Yes, we would love to have you in library land. And it sounds like other people are agreeing in chat.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you again. This has been amazing. Do you have any last parting words for those who are still on the call?
So somebody asked if I'd update my book for post-COVID-19 reality, and there's nothing I'm more excited about than more writing than I have to do now. Now I really should, and I will talk to the ALA about doing that. It makes sense. But every time that I come out of a building, a library, doing an audit or off of one of these training sessions or webinar, I just feel nothing but hope, because there's so much that's bleak in our society right now, and what you guys are doing really is the thing that gives me hope that we can all come together and work on the things that we agree on. And one of the things we sure agree on is the need for public libraries. So thank you.
Thank you again. And we did record this. The video will be posted on the State Library's YouTube page, and a link will be shared most likely tomorrow. And that will also include David and Joe's contact information in case you didn't have a chance to write that down. So one more time, thank you, David and Joe. This was fantastic. And everyone, I hope you have a great rest of the day. And we can already say have a great weekend too.
Sounds good.
Take care.
Thank
Bye,
you all.
everyone.
Bye.